I married a man who never once asked to hear my voice, and perhaps that is why I agreed to become his wife. In a world where women are expected to fill silence with chatter and laughter, Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow, offered me the rarest of gifts, the freedom to remain unheard. The day of our wedding was gray and soft, the kind of autumn morning that wraps itself around you like a shawl you did not ask for, but cannot refuse. I stood in the small chapel on my father's estate, wearing my mother's wedding gown, altered to fit my slighter frame, and I watched Sebastian wait for me at the altar with the patience of a man who expected nothing and therefore could not be disappointed. He was tall, broad of shoulder, with dark hair touched by early silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter seas. He did not smile when I reached him. He did not frown. He simply extended his hand, and I placed mine within it, and the vicar spoke the words that would bind us for the rest of our lives. I had not spoken a single word to Sebastian Blackwood before that day. Our courtship, if one could call it that, had been conducted entirely through letters and intermediaries. My father, Baron Ashford, had arranged the match in desperation. Our family's debts had grown beyond any hope of recovery, and I was the only currency he had left to trade. I was 23 years old, unmarried, and known throughout our small corner of society as the silent daughter, the one who never spoke at balls, who never laughed at gentlemen's jokes, who sat in corners with her embroidery and her downcast eyes and her absolute, immovable quiet. Most men found my silence unsettling. They would try to coax words from me as though I were a stubborn music box, winding and winding, waiting for a melody that never came. But Sebastian, when he first heard of me, did not seem troubled. According to my father, the Duke had said only this: "A wife who does not speak will suit me well enough. I have no need of conversation." At the time, I thought him cold. I thought him cruel, perhaps, or at the very least indifferent to the woman he was purchasing along with the settlement of my father's debts. But as I stood beside him in that chapel, as I felt the warmth of his hand around mine and caught the faint scent of sandalwood and rain on his coat, I understood something I had not expected. Sebastian Blackwood was not cold. He was careful. He held himself like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, every muscle tensed against the possibility of falling. The ceremony was brief. There were no guests save my father and a solicitor who served as witness. When it was done, Sebastian released my hand and offered me his arm, and we walked out of the chapel and into the waiting carriage that would take us to Ravenshollow. I had heard stories of the estate, of course. Everyone had. Ravenshollow was one of the grandest houses in the county, a sprawling manor of grey stone and Gothic arches set against the backdrop of the moors. It had been in the Blackwood family for generations, passed from duke to duke like a crown or a curse. But the stories that interested me most were not about the architecture or the gardens or the vast fortune that the estate represented. The stories that lingered in my mind were about Isabel. Isabel Blackwood, the first Duchess of Ravenshollow, had died 2 years before my marriage to Sebastian. She had been, by all accounts, everything I was not. Beautiful, vivacious, talented, adored. She played the pianoforte with the skill of a concert performer and sang with a voice that made strong men weep. She hosted grand parties that were the envy of London society. She laughed easily and spoke often and filled every room she entered with light and music and joy. And then, one winter night, she was gone. The official story was that she had fallen. A tragic accident on the grand staircase, a misstep in the dark, a tumble that ended her life before anyone could reach her. The funeral had been magnificent, the mourning period appropriately somber, and Sebastian had retreated into a grief so complete that he had not been seen in society since. Until now. Until me. I wondered, as the carriage carried us through the countryside, what had driven him to marry again. It was not desire, certainly. He had not looked at me with anything resembling passion or even curiosity. It was not companionship, for he had made clear that he did not expect conversation. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps the Blackwood name required an heir, and I was simply the most convenient vessel available. The thought should have wounded me, but I had long since learned to accept the roles that life assigned to me. I was not a woman who expected love. I was a woman who had learned to survive without it. The journey to Ravenshollow took several hours, and Sebastian spent most of it gazing out the window, his profile sharp against the gray light. I studied him in silence, as I studied everything, cataloging the details that others might miss. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened when the carriage passed a crossroads. The gold signet ring on his right hand, worn smooth with age and use. He was not a handsome man in the way that poets described, but there was something compelling about him, something that made it difficult to look away. Once, about halfway through the journey, he turned and caught me watching him. I expected him to look away, as most people did when they found me staring. But Sebastian held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said, in a voice that was lower and softer than I had expected, "You do not need to fear me, madam. I am not a man who demands more than others are willing to give." I did not respond, of course. I never responded. But something in his words stirred a feeling I had not experienced in years, a feeling that might have been hope or might have been simply the absence of dread. I inclined my head slightly, an acknowledgement if not an answer, and Sebastian turned back to the window, and we continued on in silence. Ravenshollow revealed itself slowly, emerging from the mist like a dream one is not certain whether to trust. The gates were wrought iron, tall and ornate, flanked by stone pillars topped with ravens carved in black marble. The drive wound through an avenue of ancient oaks, their branches bare and reaching, and then the house itself appeared, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was beautiful. Not in the soft, welcoming way of my father's modest estate, but in the way that mountains are beautiful, or storms, or the sea at night. The stone was dark gray, almost black in the fading light, and the windows glowed with the warm amber of candlelight. There were towers at each corner, and a grand entrance flanked by columns, and somewhere behind the main house I could see the shadow of a chapel and the distant shapes of gardens that must have been magnificent in summer, but now lay dormant under the weight of autumn. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman appeared to open the door. Sebastian descended first, then turned to offer me his hand. I took it, feeling the strength of his grip, the steadiness of his arm, and I stepped down onto the gravel drive and looked up at the house that was now my home. "Welcome to Ravenshollow," Sebastian said, and there was something in his voice that I could not quite identify. Not pride, exactly, not warning. Something closer to resignation, as though he were introducing me to a burden rather than a blessing. The household staff had assembled in the entrance hall to greet us, a long line of faces that I would need to learn in the coming days. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Holloway, curtsied and welcomed me with words that were polite, but not warm. The butler, Mr. Ashworth, bowed and murmured something about being at my service. Maids and footmen and kitchen staff, all of them watching me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something that looked almost like pity. I understood their confusion. I was not the Duchess they remembered. I was not Isabel, with her golden hair and her easy laughter and her ability to make everyone feel seen and valued. I was a stranger, a silent woman who had arrived without warning or celebration, who would sleep in the rooms that had once belonged to their beloved mistress. I could not blame them for their hesitation. I could only hope that, in time, I might earn something other than their doubt. Sebastian led me through the entrance hall and up the grand staircase, the very staircase where Isabel had fallen. I felt a chill pass through me as we climbed, though whether it was from the cold or from something else, I could not say. The stairs were wide and graceful, carpeted in deep red velvet, and at the landing there was a portrait that stopped me in my tracks. Isabel. She was as beautiful as the stories had promised, perhaps more so. Her hair was the color of honey, arranged in elaborate curls that framed a face of delicate porcelain perfection. Her eyes were blue, a light and lively blue that seemed to sparkle even in paint. She was dressed in a gown of pale pink silk, and in her hands she held a silver flute, its surface catching the light like captured starlight. "My husband," Sebastian said quietly, standing beside me as I gazed up at the portrait. He did not say her name. He did not need to. The first Duchess of Ravenshollow. The portrait was commissioned the year before her death. She insisted on being painted with her flute. She said it was the truest part of her. I looked at the flute in the portrait, at the way Isabel's fingers curled around it with obvious affection, and I felt something stir in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to recognition. I had once had a truest part of me as well, but that part had been silenced long ago, along with my voice. "Your rooms are this way," Sebastian said, turning away from the portrait with the abruptness of a man fleeing something he did not wish to see. "The east wing has been prepared for you. I trust you will find it comfortable. If there is anything you require, you may write your requests and give them to Mrs. Holloway. Write your requests, not speak them." Sebastian had understood, without being told, that I would not use my voice. I wondered how he knew. I wondered if it mattered. He led me down a long corridor lined with doors, past rooms whose purposes I could only guess, until we reached a set of double doors at the end of the hall. He opened them and stepped aside, allowing me to enter first. The rooms were lovely. A sitting room with a fireplace already blazing, a bedroom beyond with a canopied bed draped in blue silk, a dressing room with wardrobes and mirrors, and a vanity laid out with silver brushes and crystal bottles. Everything was elegant, tasteful, expensive. And everything, I noticed immediately, was new. The furniture, the linens, the carpets, even the paintings on the walls. There was nothing here that had belonged to Isabel. Sebastian had erased her from these rooms as thoroughly as if she had never existed. "I will leave you to rest," Sebastian said from the doorway. "Dinner will be served at 8. You are welcome to join me in the dining room, or if you prefer, you may take your meals here in your chambers." He paused, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like longing. "I know this is not the marriage either of us imagined, but I hope, in time, we might find some measure of peace in it." He left before I could respond, not that I would have. I stood in the center of my new sitting room, surrounded by beautiful things that held no memory, no history, no trace of the woman who had come before me, and I wondered why Sebastian had gone to such lengths to erase his first wife from these rooms, when her portrait still hung on the staircase, when her name still echoed in the whispers of the servants, when her ghost, real or imagined, still seemed to fill every corner of this grand and melancholy house. I moved to the window and looked out at the gardens below, at the maze of hedges and the distant shape of a glass house and the moors stretching beyond like a sea of brown and gold. The light was fading fast, the sun a pale disk sinking toward the horizon, and somewhere in the house a clock began to chime the hour. 6 o'clock. 2 hours until dinner. 2 hours to explore, to observe, to begin the careful work of understanding the place I had come to and the man I had married. I did not unpack my trunk. I did not ring for a maid. Instead, I took off my traveling cloak, smoothed my hair, and slipped out of my chambers into the corridor beyond. The east wing was quiet, the servants apparently occupied elsewhere, and I moved through the shadows with the ease of long practice. I had learned in my years of silence how to make myself invisible, how to walk without sound, how to breathe without notice, how to watch without being watched. It was a skill born of necessity, a defense against a world that had never quite known what to do with me. And now, in this strange new house with its secrets and its sorrows, I knew it would serve me well. I explored the corridor first, opening doors and peering into rooms that ranged from the mundane to the magnificent. A library filled with leather-bound volumes, A music room with a grand pianoforte and empty instrument stands. A small parlor with faded wallpaper and furniture draped in white sheets. Each room told a story. Each held a clue to the life that had existed here before my arrival. But none of them answered the questions that were beginning to form in my mind. It was the door at the end of the west corridor that caught my attention. Unlike the others, it was locked. I tried the handle twice, confirming what I had felt on the first attempt. And then I stood back and looked at the door more carefully. It was made of heavy oak, darker than the others, and there were scratches around the keyhole as though someone had tried, more than once, to force it open. "The West Wing," a voice said behind me, and I turned to find Mrs. Holloway watching me with an expression I could not read. "Is not in use, Your Grace. It has been closed since the late Duchess passed." I looked at her, then back at the door. Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice carefully neutral. "His Grace has ordered that it remain locked. All of Her Grace's belongings are stored there. Her gowns, her jewelry, her personal effects. He could not bear to dispose of them, but neither could he bear to see them." She paused. "I trust you understand." I inclined my head, the gesture I had perfected to convey acknowledgement without commitment. Mrs. Holloway seemed satisfied, or at least willing to pretend she was. "Shall I escort you back to your chambers, Your Grace? Dinner will be served soon, and you may wish to change." I shook my head and turned away from the locked door, walking past the housekeeper with my eyes fixed straight ahead. But even as I made my way back to the East Wing, even as I allowed a maid to help me into a dinner gown of deep green velvet, even as I descended the grand staircase and took my place at the long dining table across from my silent husband, the image of that door stayed with me. A locked room, a dead wife's belongings, a husband who could not bear to see them, but could not bear to let them go. Dinner was a quiet affair, as I had expected. Sebastian ate methodically, his attention focused on his plate, and I did the same. The food was excellent, the wine was fine, and the silence between us was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It simply was. Two strangers sharing a meal, bound by law and circumstance, waiting to see what their life together might become. It was only when the dessert course had been cleared, and Sebastian rose to excuse himself, that he spoke again. "There is something I should tell you," he said, pausing at the door. "About Isabel. About why I married you." I looked up at him, waiting. "She was not happy here," he said quietly. "In the end, I mean, the last months of her life. I thought I could make her happy. I thought my love would be enough. But it was not, and I failed her." He met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw something raw in his expression, something broken. "I do not expect you to love me. I do not even expect you to like me. But I wanted you to know that I will not make the same mistakes with you. I will not ask of you what you cannot give. And I will not pretend that this house is anything other than what it is." He left before I could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. And I sat alone at the long table, with my hands folded in my lap and my heart beating strangely in my chest. What had he meant? What mistakes had he made with Isabel? What had happened in those final months to turn a vibrant, beloved woman into someone who was not happy? The questions circled in my mind as I made my way back to my chambers, as I dismissed the maid and prepared for bed alone, as I lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my new home. The creak of old wood, the whisper of wind against the windows, the distant chime of clocks marking the passage of hours. And then, just as I was beginning to drift towards sleep, I heard something else. Something that made me sit up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. Music. Faint and far away, barely more than a whisper on the edge of hearing. But unmistakable. A melody played on a flute, sweet and sad and hauntingly beautiful, drifting through the corridors of Ravenshollow like a voice calling from the dark. I rose from my bed and went to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The music continued, rising and falling, weaving through the silence like smoke. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in the west wing, from the direction of the locked door, from the room where Isabel's belongings were kept. I stood there for a long time, listening, barely breathing, until at last the music faded and the house fell silent once more. And when I finally returned to my bed, I did not sleep. I lay awake until dawn, wondering if I had imagined the sound, wondering if the ghost of the first Duchess was more than just a memory, wondering what secrets this house held and whether I had the courage to uncover them. The flute in the portrait, the music in the night, the husband who spoke of failure and regret. I had come to Ravenshollow expecting nothing but a quiet life of dignified solitude. But as the first light of morning crept through my windows, I understood that this house would not allow me such peace. There were mysteries here, buried beneath the silence, waiting to be found. And I, the silent bride, was perhaps the only one who could hear them. The days that followed my arrival at Ravenshollow passed in a strange rhythm of discovery and concealment, each morning bringing new questions and each night leaving them unanswered. I did not hear the flute music again, though I listened for it, lying awake in the darkness, with my breath held and my ears straining against the silence. Part of me wondered if I had dreamed it, if the strangeness of my new life had conjured phantom melodies from the depths of my exhausted mind. But another part of me, the part that had learned long ago to trust what I observed over what others told me, knew that I had heard something real, something that should not have been. I spent my first week learning the geography of my new home. Ravenshollow was vast, far larger than it had appeared from the outside, a labyrinth of corridors and staircases and rooms that seemed to multiply the more I explored them. There were formal spaces designed for entertaining, drawing rooms and ballrooms, and a grand gallery lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors stretching back centuries. There were practical spaces, too, kitchens and pantries and servants' quarters that hummed with quiet efficiency. And there were forgotten spaces, rooms that had not been opened in years, their furniture shrouded in dust cloths and their windows thick with grime. The servants watched me with a mixture of curiosity and caution as I wandered the house. I could feel their eyes on me as I passed, could sense the whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. They did not know what to make of me. This silent woman who had appeared without warning to take the place of their beloved mistress. I could not blame them for their suspicion. In their position, I would have felt the same. Mrs. Holloway was the most difficult to read. She performed her duties with impeccable precision, answering my written questions promptly and ensuring that my chambers were always comfortable. But there was something guarded in her manner, something that suggested she was watching me as carefully as I was watching the house. I wondered what she knew. I wondered what she was protecting. Sebastian I saw rarely. He took his breakfast early, before I had risen, and spent his days in his study or out on the estate, attending to business I did not fully understand. We dined together each evening, those strange, silent meals that should have been awkward but somehow were not, and occasionally he would speak to me of small matters, the weather, the condition of the roads, a letter he had received from a distant cousin. He never mentioned Isabel again, and I did not ask, but I could see her in the shadows that crossed his face when he thought I was not looking, in the way his eyes would drift toward the west wing as though drawn by a force he could not resist. It was on the 8th day of my marriage that I found the music room. I had passed it before, of course, during my initial explorations. It was on the ground floor of the east wing, a large and elegant space with tall windows that looked out over the gardens. There was a grand pianoforte in the center, its surface polished to a mirror shine, and along the walls were glass cases displaying various instruments: violins and violas, a cello, several guitars, and, in the case nearest the window, a collection of flutes. I had glanced at the room briefly on my first tour of the house and moved on without much thought. But something drew me back that morning, a restlessness that I could not name. a feeling that there was something here I needed to see. I entered the room quietly, as I entered all rooms, and made my way to the case of flutes. There were 6 of them, arranged on velvet cushions of deep burgundy. 5 were made of wood, dark and polished, clearly valuable, but not extraordinary. The 6th was different. It was silver, slender, and elegant, its surface engraved with a pattern of roses and thorns that caught the light like liquid moonlight. I recognized it immediately. It was the flute from Isabel's portrait. I stood before the case for a long moment, studying the instrument. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, but there was something else about it that drew my attention, something that made my fingers itch to touch it, to feel its weight in my hands, to raise it to my lips and see what sounds it might make. I had not played a flute in years. I had not played any instrument in years. Music had been part of another life, a life I had left behind when I stopped speaking, a life that belonged to a different version of Eleanor Ashford. But standing there in the quiet of the music room, looking at Isabel's silver flute, I felt something stir in me that I had thought was dead. A longing, a memory, a whisper of who I had once been. The case was not locked. I opened it carefully, reverently, and lifted the flute from its velvet bed. It was lighter than I expected, perfectly balanced, warm to the touch despite the chill of the room. I turned it over in my hands, examining the engravings, and found, near the mouthpiece, a small inscription. For my beloved Isabel, it read, that her music may never be silenced. I do not know how long I stood there, holding the flute, lost in thoughts I could not quite name. But at some point I became aware that I was no longer alone. I turned to find Sebastian standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the instrument in my hands. "Where did you find that?" he said, and his voice was strange, tight with an emotion I could not identify. I gestured toward the case, a simple motion that required no words. Sebastian crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped before me, close enough that I could see the rapid pulse in his throat, the barely controlled tension in his jaw. "That flute," he said slowly, as though choosing each word with care, was Isabel's most treasured possession. She played it every night, every single night, without fail. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that might have been grief or might have been fear. The night she died, she played it for hours. I could hear her from my study, the same melody, over and over, as though she could not stop. And then the music stopped, and I heard a scream, and I ran to the staircase and found her at the bottom, and the flute was gone. I looked down at the instrument in my hands, then back at Sebastian. Gone! "It was not with her body," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I searched the entire house. The servants searched. We looked everywhere. And then, 3 days after the funeral, it appeared in that case, exactly where you found it. No one saw who put it there. No one knows how it returned." He met my eyes, and in his gaze, I saw something I had not expected. Not anger, not accusation, but a desperate, aching need to understand. "Sometimes," he said, "late at night, I hear it. The melody she played that last night. I hear it echoing through the halls, and I tell myself it is my imagination, my guilt, my mind playing tricks. But you are holding it now, and you are real, and I need to know. Have you heard it too?" I could have lied. I could have shaken my head, could have replaced the flute in its case and walked away and pretended that I knew nothing of midnight melodies and impossible music. But something in Sebastian's face, in the raw vulnerability of his question, made it impossible to deceive him. I nodded once and watched as something in him seemed to break and rebuild itself in the space of a single breath. "When?" he asked. I held up one finger, then another, then closed my hand. "The first night." Sebastian exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight he had carried for far too long. "I thought I was going mad," he said quietly. "I thought the grief had finally broken me. But if you heard it too, then either we are both mad or there is something in this house that I do not understand." I wanted to speak then, more than I had wanted anything in years. I wanted to tell him that I did not believe in madness, that I believed in secrets and silence and the things people hide from themselves. I wanted to tell him that I had spent my life listening, that I knew how to find the truth in the spaces between words, that I would help him understand if only he would let me. But my voice was locked away, buried beneath years of chosen silence, and all I could do was look at him and hope that he could read in my eyes what I could not say with my lips. Perhaps he could. Perhaps there was something in my expression that gave him comfort, or at least hope. He reached out, slowly, carefully, and took the flute from my hands. His fingers brushed mine as he did, and I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, a sensation I did not recognize and could not name. "I am going to tell you something," he said, still holding the flute, still standing close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. "Something I have never told anyone, and then I'm going to ask you to do something that you may find strange. Will you listen?" I nodded. "Isabel composed a song," Sebastian said. "In the months before she died, she worked on it obsessively. She would lock herself in the music room for hours, playing the same phrases over and over, making changes, starting again. She called it her heart song. She said it contained everything she could not say in words. She said that one day, when she was ready, she would play it for me, and I would finally understand her." He paused, his eyes distant. "She never played it for me. She died before she could. And the only written copy, the sheet music she had composed, disappeared along with the flute. I searched her rooms, her belongings, everything. I never found it." He looked at me then, and there was something like hope in his expression, fragile and uncertain. "The music you heard that first night. Can you remember it? Can you recall the melody?" I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to that moment, lying in my bed in the darkness, hearing the faint strains of a flute drifting through the corridors. The melody had been beautiful, achingly so, a sequence of notes that seemed to speak of longing and loss and something else, something brighter underneath. I could hear it still, faintly, like an echo in the chambers of my memory. I opened my eyes and nodded. Sebastian's breath caught. "Would you?" he asked, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Would you be willing to play it? On this flute? I need to know if it is the same song. I need to know if what I have been hearing is real or if it is only the ghost of my own guilt." I looked at the silver flute in his hands, at the inscription that promised that Isabel's music would never be silenced. I thought of the locked door in the west wing, the room full of a dead woman's belongings, the portrait on the staircase with its painted smile and its painted flute. I thought of the music in the night, and the husband who heard it too, and the mystery that was beginning to take shape around me, like fog rising from the moors. I reached out and took the flute from Sebastian's hands. I had not played in years, had not allowed myself even to think of playing. Music had been my voice before I chose silence, my way of speaking when words felt too dangerous. I had studied the flute as a girl, had loved it with the pure and uncomplicated love of childhood, had dreamed of playing in concert halls before the world taught me that some dreams were not meant to be realized. When I stopped speaking, I stopped playing too. It had seemed like a necessary sacrifice, a closing of doors that needed to remain closed. But now, standing in the music room at Ravenshollow with Sebastian watching me and Isabel's flute cool and familiar in my hands, I felt those doors begin to tremble on their hinges. The instrument fit my grip as though it had been made for me. The silver was warm now, warmed by our combined touch, and when I raised it to my lips I could smell the faint residue of polish and something else. Something floral and delicate that might have been a trace of Isabel's perfume. I closed my eyes. I remembered the melody, and I began to play. The first notes were hesitant, rusty from disuse, but the music came back to me faster than I had expected, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought faltered. The melody unfolded beneath my fingers, sweet and sad and hauntingly familiar. And as I played, I felt something unlock inside me. Some door that had been closed for so long I had forgotten it existed. The music filled the room, filled my chest, filled the silence that had been my companion for so many years. And for a moment, I was not the silent bride or the failed daughter or the purchased wife. I was simply Eleanor, playing a song that someone had written with their whole heart, giving voice to emotions that could not be spoken. When the melody ended, I lowered the flute and opened my eyes. Sebastian was staring at me as though he had never seen me before, as though I had transformed into something entirely unexpected. There were tears on his cheeks, I realized with a start. The Duke of Ravenshollow, the cold and careful man who never smiled and never laughed and never showed emotion, was weeping. "That is it," he whispered. "That is her song." Note for note, exactly as she played it. He took a step toward me, then stopped, as though uncertain whether he had the right to come closer. "How? How did you know it?" I could not answer. I could only shake my head, as bewildered as he was, because I did not know. I had heard the melody once, in the darkness of my first night, and somehow it had lodged itself in my memory with perfect clarity, as though it had been waiting there all along, as though it belonged to me as much as it had belonged to Isabel. Sebastian reached out slowly and took my hand. His fingers were warm, his grip gentle but firm, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "Thank you," he said. "I do not know what this means or how it is possible. But thank you for playing, for helping me believe that I am not losing my mind." I squeezed his hand in response, a gesture that felt more intimate than any words I could have spoken. And in that moment, standing in the music room with the silver flute in one hand and Sebastian's hand in the other, I felt something shift between us. Something that had been distant and formal and cold began to warm, like the first green shoots pushing through snow at the end of winter. We were strangers still, bound by contract and convenience, but we were also something else now. We were two people who had shared something strange and inexplicable, two people who had heard the same impossible music and recognized the same impossible truth. There were secrets in this house, secrets about Isabel, about her death, about the song she had never finished, and the flute that had disappeared and returned. And somehow, for reasons I did not yet understand, those secrets had chosen me as their keeper. Sebastian released my hand and stepped back, composing himself with visible effort. "We should speak more of this," he said, "but not here, not now. Tonight, after dinner, will you come to my study? There are things I need to show you, things about Isabel that I have never shared with anyone." I nodded, and he nodded in return, and then he left me alone in the music room with the silver flute still warm in my hands and a melody still echoing in my heart. I did not know what awaited me in Sebastian's study. I did not know what secrets he was prepared to share or what truths might emerge from the shadows of this house. But I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wanted to find out, that I needed to find out. Not just for Sebastian, and not just to solve the mystery of Isabel's death, but for myself. Because somewhere in the music and the silence and the locked doors of Ravenshollow, there was an answer to a question I had not yet learned to ask. I spent the rest of the day in a state of distracted anticipation. I walked through the gardens, though the autumn chill made it unpleasant. I sat in the library and pretended to read. I took tea in my chambers and watched the light fade beyond my window. And all the while, the melody played in my mind, that sweet, sad song that Isabel had called her heart song, the music that was supposed to tell Sebastian everything she could not say in words. What had she wanted him to understand? What secrets had she poured into those notes? Those phrases, those delicate arrangements of sound and silence. And why, if the song was meant for Sebastian, had she never played it for him? She had died before she could, he had said. But what if that was not quite true? What if she had chosen not to play it, had kept it locked away for reasons that had nothing to do with timing or readiness? The questions circled in my mind like birds around a tower, never landing, never resting. By the time the clock struck 8 and I descended to the dining room, I was nearly vibrating with suppressed curiosity. Dinner was quieter than usual, if such a thing were possible. Sebastian seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant, his food barely touched. I watched him across the expanse of white linen and silver candlesticks and wondered what he was thinking, what memories were playing behind those winter sea eyes. He had loved Isabel, that much was clear. He had loved her and lost her and blamed himself for her unhappiness. But there was more to the story than grief. There was guilt, yes, but guilt of what kind? What had happened in those final months, those final days, that final night? When the meal was finished and the servants had cleared the table, Sebastian rose and looked at me across the room. "My study is in the west wing," he said. "Will you come?" I stood and followed him out of the dining room, down the corridor, past the grand staircase with Isabel's portrait watching from the landing, into the west wing that had been forbidden territory since my arrival. We passed the locked door without stopping, though I felt its presence like a held breath, and continued to the end of the hall where a heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. Sebastian's study was nothing like I had expected. Where the rest of Ravenshollow was formal and ornate, this room was warm and cluttered and lived in. Books were piled on every surface, papers scattered across the desk, a fire burning low in the grate. There were maps on the walls and a telescope by the window, and in the corner a small table with a chess set frozen mid-game. And there, on the desk, was a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Sebastian closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in the chair nearest the fire. He took the chair opposite, the letters in his hands, and for a long moment he simply looked at them, his expression unreadable. "These are letters from Isabel," he said finally. "Letters she wrote in the last months of her life. Not to me, to someone else. I found them hidden in her dressing table after she died." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. "She was in love with another man, Eleanor. My wife, the woman I adored, was planning to leave me. And the night she died, I confronted her about it. We argued. Terrible things were said. And then she ran out of the room and up the stairs, and she fell and she died. And the last words I ever spoke to her were words of anger and accusation." I sat very still, absorbing what he had told me. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together now, forming a picture that was sadder and more complicated than I had imagined. Isabel, the beloved wife, had not been as happy as everyone believed. She had been trapped, perhaps, or longing for something her marriage could not provide. And Sebastian, the grieving husband, was not haunted by mere loss. He was haunted by the belief that he had caused her death. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw not the cold, distant duke I had married, but a man who had been carrying an unbearable weight for 2 years. A man who needed desperately to confess and to be absolved. "I have never told anyone this," he said. "The official story is that she fell, an accident, a tragedy. But I know the truth. I drove her to that staircase. My anger, my jealousy, my inability to let her go even though I knew she wanted to leave. I killed her, Eleanor. Perhaps not with my hands, but with my words. With my refusal to see what she needed. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer some comfort, but I did not know how. I could not speak, and even if I could, what words would be adequate for such pain? Instead, I did what I had always done. I listened. I watched. I waited for him to tell me more. The man she loved, Sebastian continued, his voice steadier now, was a musician. A composer she had met in London during the season before our marriage. She had ended the affair when we became engaged, or so she told me in one of these letters. But she never stopped loving him, and he never stopped writing to her, begging her to come back. He paused, and something like bitter amusement flickered across his face. The song she composed, her heart song, was for him, not for me. It was a message, a farewell, a way of telling him everything she felt but could not say. She was going to play it for me on our anniversary, she wrote, as a way of explaining why she had to leave. She thought that if I heard the music, I would understand, that I would let her go. He set the letters down on the table between us and leaned back in his chair, exhausted. "But I did not understand," he said quietly. "I heard the music that night, playing over and over, and I did not understand what it meant. I thought she was simply practicing, preparing for some performance. I did not know it was a confession. I did not know it was goodbye. And by the time I confronted her about the letters I had found, it was too late. She was already at the top of the stairs. She was already falling. The fire crackled in the silence. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the windows, carrying with it the scent of rain. I sat in my chair and looked at Sebastian, at this man who had married me because he needed someone who would not demand love or conversation or understanding. And I felt my heart crack open with something that might have been pity, or might have been something else entirely. He was not a villain. He was not a monster. He was simply a man who had loved unwisely and lost catastrophically and could not find his way back to the light. I rose from my chair and crossed the small distance between us. Sebastian looked up at me, surprised, and I saw the question in his eyes, the uncertainty about what I intended. I knelt before him, took his hands in mine, and held them tightly. It was the only comfort I knew how to offer. It was the only language I had. We stayed like that for a long moment, two strangers in a firelit room, connected by touch and silence and the shared weight of secrets finally spoken. And when Sebastian finally pulled me to my feet and looked into my eyes, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. "You do not blame me," he said, and it was not quite a question. I shook my head. Why not? I could not answer. But I think he understood anyway. Because blame was a luxury that neither of us could afford. Because we were both broken in our own ways, both carrying guilt and grief, and the memory of words that should have been spoken differently. Because in this house of locked doors and midnight music and impossible mysteries, we had found each other, and perhaps that was the beginning of something neither of us had dared to expect. Sebastian released my hands and stepped back, composing himself once more. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, for not running away." He paused, and a ghost of a smile crossed his face, so faint I might have imagined it. "Tomorrow, if you are willing, I would like to show you something that might help explain the music we have both been hearing. Something I have been too afraid to face alone." I nodded, and he nodded in return, and when I left his study a few minutes later, walking back through the shadowed corridors to my chambers in the East Wing, I carried with me the knowledge of Isabel's secret love and Sebastian's secret guilt, and the song that had been meant to explain everything, but had instead become the haunting refrain of a house that could not let go of its ghosts. That night, lying in my bed, I heard the music again. The same melody, the same sweet, sad notes, drifting through the darkness like a voice from beyond the grave. But this time I did not feel afraid. I felt something else entirely. Curiosity, determination, and the first stirring of a feeling I had almost forgotten how to recognize. The feeling of being needed, the feeling of having a purpose, the feeling of being, perhaps for the first time in years, exactly where I was supposed to be. Tomorrow, Sebastian would show me something. Tomorrow, another door would open. And I would be ready to walk through it, whatever waited on the other side. Morning arrived wrapped in mist, the kind that softens the edges of the world and makes everything feel suspended between waking and dreaming. I rose early, before the maid could come to help me dress, and stood at my window watching the gardens emerge slowly from the gray. The roses were bare now, their thorns black against the pale light, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the cry of ravens circling the towers. I thought of Sebastian's promise. Today he would show me something that might explain the music, something he had been too afraid to face alone. The words had stayed with me through the night, weaving themselves into my dreams, and now, in the quiet clarity of dawn, I felt both eager and apprehensive. Whatever waited for me in the hours ahead, I sensed that it would change things, that once I saw what Sebastian wanted to show me, there would be no going back to comfortable ignorance. Breakfast was served in the small morning room, a space I had come to prefer over the formal dining room, with its long table and its echoing silence. Sebastian was already there when I arrived, standing by the window with a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He looked as though he had not slept, shadows beneath his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. When he saw me, he set down his cup and crossed the room to meet me. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was careful, measured. "I hope you slept well." I inclined my head, the gesture that had become our shared language of acknowledgement. After breakfast, Sebastian continued, "I would like to take you to the West Wing, to Isabel's rooms." He paused, and I saw the effort it cost him to speak these words. "I have not entered them since her death. The door has been locked for 2 years. But after last night, after what you played and what I told you, I believe it is time. I believe there may be answers there, answers that I have been too cowardly to seek." I reached out and touched his arm, a brief contact meant to convey support. Sebastian looked at my hand, then at my face, and something in his expression softened. "You are braver than I am," he said quietly. "You came to this house knowing nothing of its secrets, and yet you have not flinched from any of them. I do not know why you chose silence, Eleanor, or what happened to make you retreat from the world, but I am grateful that you are here. I am grateful that I do not have to face this alone." We ate breakfast in our customary quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was not the silence of strangers carefully maintaining distance. It was the silence of two people preparing themselves for something difficult, gathering their strength, finding comfort in each other's presence, even without words. When the meal was finished, Sebastian rose and offered me his arm. I took it, feeling the warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, and together we walked out of the morning room and into the corridor that led to the West Wing. The house seemed different in daylight, less ominous than it had appeared on my nighttime wanderings. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting patterns on the floor, and the paintings on the walls seemed less like watching eyes and more like memories preserved in oil and canvas. We passed servants going about their duties, and I noticed how they looked at us, at the way I held Sebastian's arm, at the direction we were walking. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the end of the corridor, her face carefully blank, and said nothing as we passed. The locked door was exactly as I remembered it, heavy oak darkened with age, scratches around the keyhole where someone had once tried to force it open. Sebastian stopped before it and withdrew a key from his pocket. It was an old key, ornate and heavy, the kind that belongs to doors that guard important things. "I have not used this since the day I locked it," he said. "After the funeral, I came here one last time. I thought I would pack away her things, donate her gowns to charity, dispose of the remnants of her life in the way one is supposed to. But when I entered the room and saw everything exactly as she had left it, I could not do it. I could not erase her so completely. So I locked the door and told myself I would return when I was ready." He looked at the key in his hand, then at me. "I do not know if I am ready now, but I know I cannot wait any longer." He inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then yielded with a heavy click that seemed to echo through the corridor. Sebastian pushed the door open, and a gust of stale air rushed out to meet us, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and dust and something else, something that might have been perfume or might have been memory. The room beyond was shrouded in shadow, the curtains drawn against the light, the furniture draped in cloths that had once been white but were now gray with accumulated dust. Sebastian stepped inside first, and I followed close behind, my eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness. He crossed to the windows and pulled back the curtains, and suddenly the room was flooded with light, and I could see Isabel's world for the first time. It was beautiful. Even under the dust, even after 2 years of neglect, the room was undeniably beautiful. The walls were papered in pale blue silk, the furniture was delicate and feminine, and everywhere there were touches of elegance and taste that spoke of a woman who cared deeply about her surroundings. There was a vanity table with a mirror and crystal bottles, a chaise longue upholstered in cream velvet, a writing desk by the window with papers still scattered across its surface. And in the corner, near the fireplace, there was a music stand with sheets of paper still resting on its ledge. Sebastian moved through the room like a man walking through a dream, his fingers trailing across surfaces, disturbing the dust, leaving tracks like the marks of ghosts. He stopped at the vanity and picked up a hairbrush, still threaded with strands of golden hair. He stopped at the wardrobe and opened its doors, revealing gowns in every color, silks and satins and laces that had once adorned the most beautiful woman in the county. He stopped at the bed, still made with its coverlet of pale pink, and stood there for a long moment with his back to me, his shoulders trembling. I gave him time. I understood what it meant to return to a place that held the weight of loss, to confront the physical evidence of someone who was gone. I had done it myself, years ago, in a different house, a different life. The silence was the only gift I could offer, the space to feel whatever he needed to feel without judgment or expectation. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes were dry, but his face was drawn. "The music stand," he said. "That is where she composed. Will you look at the papers?" I cannot bring myself to touch them. I crossed the room to the corner where the music stand waited, its wooden frame still elegant despite the dust. The papers on its ledge were yellowed at the edges, their ink faded but still legible. I lifted them carefully, gently, and began to look through them. There were several sheets, each covered in musical notation in a hand that was precise and feminine. Some were incomplete, fragments of melodies that had never been finished. Some were copies of published works, concertos and sonatas by composers whose names I recognized. But at the bottom of the stack, tucked beneath the others as though hidden, there was a single sheet that was different from the rest. The paper was heavier, the ink darker, the notation more careful. At the top, in letters that had been traced over multiple times as though the writer wanted to be certain they would never fade, was a title, Heart Song, and beneath the title, in smaller script, for S, that he may finally understand. I held the paper up so Sebastian could see it, and I watched his face as he read the inscription. His expression shifted through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat, confusion and recognition and pain, and something that might have been relief. He crossed the room and took the paper from my hands, staring at it as though it contained the answers to questions he had been asking for years. "For S," he read aloud. "I always assumed the song was for him, for the man she loved. His name was Simon Ashworth. He was a composer, as I told you. I thought she had written this for him, as a farewell, as a declaration. But this says for S, that he may finally understand." He looked up at me, and in his eyes, I saw the dawning of a realization that changed everything. What if I was wrong? What if the song was not for Simon at all? What if it was for me? I thought of the melody I had played in the music room, the sweet, sad song that had moved Sebastian to tears. I thought of the letters he had shown me, Isabel's confessions of love for another man. I thought of the night she died, the argument, the fall, the flute that disappeared and returned. And I thought of something else, something that had been nagging at the edges of my mind since I first heard the music drifting through the corridors of Ravenshollow. The song was sad, yes, But it was not the sadness of a woman saying goodbye to a lover she was running toward. It was the sadness of a woman saying goodbye to a life she was leaving behind, a home, a husband, a love that had never quite found its footing, but had been real nonetheless. I reached out and took Sebastian's hand, drawing his attention to me. Then I pointed to the music stand, to the place where the papers had been hidden, tucked beneath the others as though waiting to be found. And I pointed to my heart. Sebastian stared at me for a long moment, struggling to understand. Then, slowly, comprehension dawned. "You think she hid it?" he said. "You think she put it there deliberately, where I would find it, where I would eventually look? You think she wanted me to discover this after she was gone?" I nodded. "But why? Why not simply play it for me? Why not tell me what she felt instead of hiding it in a stack of papers?" I did not have an answer. But I had a theory, one that was beginning to form from the fragments of information I had gathered. Isabel had been planning to leave. She had loved another man, or thought she did. But at the last moment, perhaps in those final hours before her death, something had changed. She had realized that the love she was running toward was not the love she truly wanted. She had realized that Sebastian, for all his faults, for all the ways their marriage had failed, was the one she could not bear to leave. The song was her confession, her apology, her attempt to explain what she could not say in words. She had planned to play it for him, to let the music speak for her, and then she would have told him the truth. She would have chosen to stay. But she never got the chance. Sebastian had found the letters. He had confronted her, and in the chaos of that argument, in the anger and the hurt and the terrible misunderstanding, she had fallen. I looked at Sebastian and saw that he was beginning to reach the same conclusion. His face was pale, his hands trembling where they held the sheet of music. "She was going to stay," he whispered. "She was going to choose me. And I destroyed it. I destroyed everything before she could tell me. No, I wanted to say. No, you did not know. You could not have known." But my voice was locked away, as it had been for years, and all I could do was shake my head and squeeze his hand and hope that he could read the truth in my eyes. We stood there for a long time, in Isabel's dusty room with the morning light streaming through the windows and the weight of revelation settling around us. Sebastian wept, silently, tears tracking down his cheeks and falling onto the yellowed paper in his hands. I held his hand and let him grieve, not just for Isabel, but for the future they might have had, the understanding that had come too late. When he finally composed himself, his voice was rough, but steady. "I need to know what happened that night," he said. "I need to understand how she fell. For 2 years I have blamed myself, believed that my anger drove her to her death. But if she was planning to stay, if she had chosen me, then something else must have happened. Something I do not remember or did not see." He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart skip. "Will you help me? Will you help me discover the truth?" I did not hesitate. I nodded once, firmly, and I saw the relief flood his features. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you, Eleanor. I do not know what I did to deserve your kindness, but I am grateful for it." We spent the rest of the morning searching Isabel's room for any other clues that might explain the events of that fateful night. Sebastian read through the papers on her writing desk, while I examined the drawers and cabinets, looking for hidden compartments or forgotten letters. We found nothing of immediate significance, only the ordinary artifacts of a life interrupted. But the search itself felt important. It felt like a beginning. It was nearly noon when I discovered the diary. It was hidden in the bottom of Isabel's wardrobe, beneath a stack of silk scarves and lavender sachets. A small leather-bound book with a brass clasp, its pages filled with handwriting that matched the inscription on the sheet music. I held it up for Sebastian to see, and his eyes widened. "Her diary," he said. "I did not know she kept one." I handed it to him, and he opened it carefully, reverently, as though afraid it might crumble in his hands. The entries were dated, beginning 2 years before Isabel's death and ending 3 days before. Sebastian began to read, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages, and I watched his expression change as he absorbed the words his wife had written. She was unhappy, he said after a long silence. She felt trapped. She loved the music, the composing, the performing, but I did not give her enough space to pursue it. I was jealous of the time she spent at the pianoforte, jealous of the attention she gave to her flute. I wanted her to focus on me, on our marriage, on the duties of a duchess. He looked up at me, anguished. I did not realize I was suffocating her. I thought I was loving her. I knelt beside him and took the diary gently from his hands. I turned to the final entries, the pages written in the last week of Isabel's life, and I read them silently, my heart aching with every word. The entries spoke of turmoil and decision. Isabel had been in love with Simon, yes, but her love had begun to fade as she realized that he wanted her only for her talent, not for herself. She had started to see Sebastian differently, to appreciate his steadiness, his devotion, his willingness to give her everything even when she pushed him away. She had decided to end the affair, to commit fully to her marriage, to play her heart song for Sebastian and begin again. The final entry was dated the day before her death. Tomorrow, she had written, I will tell him everything. I will play him my song and explain what it means. I will confess my mistakes and ask for his forgiveness. And if he can find it in his heart to forgive me, we will start anew. I love him. I did not know it until now, but I do. He is my home. He has always been my home. I looked up at Sebastian, and I saw that he had been reading over my shoulder. His face was ashen, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She loved me, he said, and his voice broke on the words. She loved me, and I never knew. I closed the diary and placed it in his hands. It was his now, Isabel's final gift, the truth she had never been able to speak. He clutched it to his chest and bowed his head, and I understood that he needed time alone to absorb what he had learned. I rose to my feet and moved toward the door, but Sebastian's voice stopped me. Eleanor. I turned back. Stay, please. I do not want to be alone with this. Not yet. So I stayed. I sat in the chair by the window while Sebastian read through the diary from beginning to end, his expressions shifting like weather across a moor. I watched the light change as the morning gave way to afternoon, as the shadows lengthened and the house settled into its daily rhythms around us. And when Sebastian finally closed the diary and looked at me, his eyes were clearer than I had ever seen them. I understand now, he said. She did not fall because of our argument. She fell because she was running toward me, not away. She was coming to tell me the truth, to play me the song, to ask for forgiveness. And somehow, in her haste, she lost her footing on the stairs. It was a simpler explanation than I had expected, but it made a kind of terrible sense. A woman running down a dark staircase, her heart full of hope and fear, her mind already composing the words she would say. A misstep, a fall, a life ended before it could begin again. But there was still the matter of the music, the melody I had heard on my first night at Ravenshollow, the song that Sebastian had heard too. If Isabel had died before she could play her heart song, who was playing it now? I looked at Sebastian and saw that he was thinking the same thing. His brow was furrowed, his eyes distant. The music, he said slowly. You heard it. I have heard it. But if Isabel is gone, truly gone, then who is playing her flute in the night? It was a question I could not answer, not yet. But as I sat in Isabel's dusty room with her diary on the table and her heart song in my memory, I felt certain that the answer was close. That somewhere in this house, in these rooms, in the secrets that still remained to be uncovered, there was an explanation that would make everything clear. We left Isabel's chambers late in the afternoon, taking the diary and the sheet music with us. Sebastian locked the door behind us, but this time the gesture felt different. Not like sealing away a tomb, but like closing a chapter that had finally been read. As we walked back through the west wing toward the inhabited parts of the house, I noticed something I had not seen before. A door, smaller than the others, set into the wall between two windows. It was painted the same color as the wainscoting, easy to miss if one was not looking carefully, and it was slightly ajar. I stopped and pointed, and Sebastian followed my gaze. "That door," he said, "leads to the servants' passage. It connects the west wing to the rest of the house. The staff used it when Isabel was alive to bring her tea or attend to her needs without disturbing the main corridors." He paused, frowning. "I ordered it closed after her death. No one should be using it." He crossed to the door and pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The dust on the steps had been disturbed. Someone had been here recently. Someone had walked these stairs, perhaps more than once. Sebastian looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same thought that was forming in my mind. The music in the night, the flute that had disappeared and returned, the passages that connected the forgotten parts of the house to the inhabited wings. Someone was playing Isabel's song, someone who knew the servants' passages, someone who had access to the silver flute and the heart song that was supposed to remain hidden. We were closer to the truth than ever before. But the truth, I was beginning to realize, might be stranger than either of us had imagined. "Tomorrow," Sebastian said quietly. "Tomorrow we will search these passages. We will find whoever has been moving through the house unseen, and we will discover why they have been playing Isabel's music." He looked at me, and something passed between us, an understanding that needed no words. Together. I nodded, together. And as we walked back toward the light and warmth of the inhabited house, I felt the weight of the mystery pressing around us like the fog that wrapped Ravenshollow each morning, dense and obscuring, waiting to be burned away by the rising sun. The truth was coming. I could feel it approaching, inevitable as dawn. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The servants' passage was darker than I had expected, a narrow corridor that wound through the bones of the house like a vein through flesh. Sebastian had brought a lantern, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I followed close behind him as we descended the stairs and entered the hidden world that lay between the rooms of Ravenshollow. We had risen early, before the household stirred, slipping out of our respective chambers and meeting at the small door in the west wing corridor. Sebastian had spent the previous evening studying the old architectural plans of the estate, tracing the routes of the servants' passages with his finger while I watched. The house was riddled with them, he had explained, built in an era when the wealthy preferred not to see the people who maintained their comfort. Some of the passages had been sealed decades ago, but others remained accessible, connecting the kitchens to the dining rooms, the bedchambers to the laundry, and the west wing to nearly every other part of the manor. If someone has been using these passages to move unseen, Sebastian had said, they could reach almost any room in the house without being noticed, including Isabel's chambers, including the music room where her flute was kept. Now, walking through the dim and dusty corridor, I understood why the passages had been abandoned by all but the most essential servants. The air was close and stale, the walls narrow enough that my shoulders occasionally brushed the cold stone. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten lace, and beneath our feet the floor was uneven, treacherous in the flickering light. It was not a place one would choose to spend time unless necessity demanded it, or unless one wished to remain hidden. Sebastian paused at a junction where 3 corridors met, consulting his memory of the architectural plans. "This way leads to the kitchens," he said softly, gesturing to the left. "This one to the main staircase. And this one," he pointed ahead, "continues deeper into the house, toward the old wing that was closed before my grandfather's time." Why was it closed, I wondered, but of course I could not ask. Sebastian seemed to sense my question nonetheless. "There was a fire," he explained, "long before I was born." The old wing was damaged beyond repair, or so it was thought. My grandfather sealed it rather than spend the fortune it would have cost to restore. He glanced at me, the lantern light catching the angles of his face. I have not been there since I was a boy. We used to play in the passages as children, my brother and I, daring each other to go farther than the one before. But the old wing always frightened me. There was something about it that felt wrong, even then. We continued forward, deeper into the passage, and I noticed that the dust on the floor was increasingly disturbed. Not just footprints, though there were those too, but other marks as well. The drag of fabric, the scrape of something being carried. Someone had been through here many times, and recently. Sebastian noticed it too. His jaw tightened, and he quickened his pace, following the trail like a hunter tracking prey. The corridor began to slope downward, and the air grew colder, damper, carrying with it the scent of old stone and something else, something organic and green, like moss or growing things. The passage ended at a door, heavier than the others we had encountered, its wood swollen with age and moisture. Sebastian tried the handle and found it stuck. He put his shoulder against it and pushed, and after a moment of resistance the door groaned open, revealing a space beyond that made me catch my breath. It was a conservatory, or had been once. A glass-roofed room filled with the skeletal remains of plants that had died long ago, their pots cracked and overturned, their leaves reduced to brown dust. Daylight filtered through the clouded glass above, pale and diffuse, illuminating the wreckage of what must once have been a beautiful space. There were stone benches and a dry fountain, and in the center of the room a pianoforte so old and damaged that its keys had yellowed to the color of aged bone. But it was not the conservatory itself that captured my attention. It was what I saw at the far end of the room, near a door that led to another part of the old wing. A figure, small and slight, wrapped in a faded shawl, sitting on one of the stone benches with something silver gleaming in her hands. Sebastian saw her at the same moment I did. He froze, the lantern trembling slightly, and then he spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Holloway?" The figure looked up, and I saw that it was indeed the housekeeper, her stern face transformed by an expression I had never seen on her before. Not guilt, exactly, and not fear. Something closer to relief, as though she had been waiting for this moment, perhaps even hoping for it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was calm, almost gentle. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me." Sebastian crossed the room in quick strides, stopping a few feet from where she sat. In her hands, I saw now, was the silver flute. Isabel's flute, the one I had played in the music room, the one that had disappeared and returned after her death. Mrs. Holloway held it carefully, reverently, as though it were something precious beyond measure. "Explain yourself," Sebastian said, and though his voice was steady, I could hear the strain beneath it. "You have been using the passages. You have been playing my wife's flute in the night. Why?" Mrs. Holloway looked at him for a long moment, then at me, then back at him. She seemed to be making a decision, weighing her words, choosing how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with a weariness that seemed to have accumulated over years. "I have served this house for 32 years, she said. "I came here as a young woman, barely older than her Grace is now." She nodded toward me. I was a housemaid then, and I worked my way up through the ranks, earned my position through diligence and loyalty. I have seen 3 generations of Blackwoods born and die within these walls. I have kept their secrets. I have guarded their reputations. I have given my life to this family. She paused, her fingers moving gently over the silver surface of the flute. And I loved her. Isabel. Not in the way that causes scandal, but in the way a mother loves a daughter, though I had no right to such feelings. She was kind to me in a way that the gentry rarely are to servants. She spoke to me as an equal. She shared her music with me, played for me in the evenings when His Grace was away, taught me to appreciate the beauty of what she created. When she died, I lost the only person in this house who had ever truly seen me." Sebastian's expression had shifted as Mrs. Holloway spoke, the anger draining away to be replaced by something more complex. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I did not know you were close to her." "No," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "You did not. Because you did not see her, Your Grace. Not really. You loved her, I do not doubt that. But you loved the idea of her, the beautiful wife, the perfect duchess, the ornament that graced your arm at balls and dinners. You did not see the woman who wept in her chambers, who poured her heart into her music because she could not pour it into her marriage, who felt so alone in this grand house that she confided in a housekeeper because there was no one else." The words were harsh, but Mrs. Holloway delivered them without malice. She was stating facts, not accusations, describing a reality that she had witnessed while Sebastian had remained blind to it. "I know about the letters," she continued. "I know about Simon Ashworth. I know that she considered leaving you, that she was torn between the life she had and the life she thought she wanted, and I know that in the end she chose you. She told me, the morning of the day she died. She said she had been a fool, that she had nearly thrown away the one good thing in her life for a fantasy. She said she was going to tell you everything, play you her song, and beg your forgiveness." Sebastian's face had gone pale. "And the flute? The music in the night?" Mrs. Holloway looked down at the instrument in her hands. "After she died, I could not bear to let her music die with her. I took the flute from her chambers before anyone else could find it, hid it until the grief had faded and I could bear to touch it again. And then I began to play. Not well, not as she played, but well enough to remember the melody she had taught me, her heart song, the one she never got to share with you. She raised her eyes to Sebastian's, and I saw that they were bright with unshed tears. I played it in the passages where no one would hear, or so I thought. I did not realize the sound carried through the walls. I did not mean to haunt you, Your Grace. I only meant to keep her memory alive, to ensure that her song was not forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy with revelation and regret. I watched Sebastian struggle with the emotions that crossed his face, watched him absorb the truth that Mrs. Holloway had offered and reconcile it with everything he had believed. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You should have told me. All of this. You should have told me years ago. Would you have listened?" Mrs. Holloway asked gently. "Would you have been able to hear what I had to say when you were so consumed by your own guilt?" Sebastian had no answer for that. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, and I saw the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything he was carrying. 2 years of blame and grief, 2 years of believing he had driven his wife to her death, and now the revelation that the truth had been waiting all along, held in the hands of a servant who had loved Isabel as much as he had. I moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel my presence. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a storm of emotions I could not begin to untangle. But beneath the pain and confusion, there was something else. A glimmer of hope, perhaps. A recognition that the past, though it could not be changed, might finally be understood. "The flute," I heard him say, his voice steadier now. "May I have it?" Mrs. Holloway rose from the bench and crossed the room to stand before us. She held out the silver flute, and Sebastian took it with hands that trembled only slightly. It gleamed in the pale light from the glass roof, beautiful and strange, an object that had carried so much meaning for so many people. "There is something else," Mrs. Holloway said, "something I found in her chambers, hidden in a place I do not think even she remembered. I have been keeping it, waiting for the right moment to share it, waiting until you were ready to hear what it had to say." She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its creases soft from being opened and closed many times. She handed it to Sebastian, and I watched as he unfolded it and began to read. His expression changed as he read, shifting from confusion to wonder to something that looked almost like peace. When he finished, he looked up at Mrs. Holloway with tears in his eyes. "She wrote this?" "The night before she died," Mrs. Holloway confirmed. "She gave it to me for safekeeping. She said she would ask for it back when she was ready to give it to you herself. But she never had the chance." Sebastian turned to me and held out the paper. "Read it," he said. "Please, I want you to know what she wrote." I took the paper and looked at the words inscribed there in Isabel's graceful hand. "My dearest Sebastian," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will have told you everything. I will have confessed my mistakes, my foolishness, my terrible lapse in judgment. I will have played you my heart song and begged for your forgiveness. And you will either have granted it or you will not, and our future will be decided one way or another. But before that moment comes, I want you to know something that I have never said clearly enough. I love you. I have always loved you, even when I did not know it, even when I was too blind and too afraid to see what was in front of me. You are not perfect, and neither am I, but you are mine, and I am yours, and that is all that matters. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that I choose you. I will always choose you. Your Isabel." I looked up from the letter and found Sebastian watching me, his face open in a way I had never seen before. "She loved me," he said simply. "She chose me, and I spent 2 years believing I had destroyed her." Mrs. Holloway stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. "You did not destroy her, Your Grace. You loved her imperfectly, as all of us love. But she knew that, and she forgave you, and she was coming to tell you so. Her death was a tragedy, not a punishment. An accident, not a judgment. You must forgive yourself, as she would have forgiven you." Sebastian closed his eyes, and I saw the moment when something inside him shifted, released, let go. The guilt he had carried for 2 years, the blame he had heaped upon himself, the conviction that he was responsible for Isabel's death, all of it began to loosen its grip. It would not disappear overnight, I knew. Such wounds take time to heal. But the healing could begin now, in this dusty conservatory with its dead plants and its clouded glass and its secrets finally brought into the light. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at me. "Eleanor," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before, warmer, more intimate. "I do not know how to thank you for listening, for helping me find the truth, for being here." I reached out and took his hand, the gesture that had become our language, and I squeezed it gently. He squeezed back, and something passed between us, a current of understanding and connection that needed no words. Mrs. Holloway watched us with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been hope. "There is one more thing," she said, "something I think Her Grace should see." She led us through the conservatory and through the door at the far end, into a corridor I had not known existed. The passage was cleaner here, the dust recently disturbed, and at the end of it was a room that made me stop and stare. It was a music room, smaller and more intimate than the one in the main house, but clearly designed for the same purpose. There was a pianoforte against one wall, and instrument cases arranged neatly on shelves, and sheet music organized in careful stacks on a table by the window. Unlike the rest of the old wing, this room had been maintained, cared for, kept alive. "I have been tending to it," Mrs. Holloway explained. "It was Lady Isabel's secret place where she came to compose when she wanted solitude. She showed it to me in the first year of her marriage, swore me to secrecy, asked me to help her keep it hidden. I have continued to maintain it in her memory." Sebastian walked through the room slowly, taking in the details, the evidence of his wife's hidden life. He stopped at the table of sheet music and began to look through the pages, his expression shifting as he recognized what he was seeing. "These are her compositions," he said. "Dozens of them. I had no idea she had written so much. She was prolific," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "She poured her heart into her music. It was how she made sense of the world. Sebastian picked up one of the sheets and studied it. This one is dated a month before she died, and this one 3 weeks. She was working right up until the end. He set the papers down and turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something new. Not just gratitude or affection, but a kind of revelation, as though he were seeing me clearly for the first time. "You understand this," he said. "The music, the silence, the need to express what cannot be spoken. You understand it in a way I never did." I nodded, because it was true. Music had been my voice before I chose silence, my way of speaking when words felt too dangerous. I had given it up when I gave up speaking, had buried it along with everything else I could not bear to remember. But standing in Isabel's secret music room, surrounded by the evidence of a woman who had found solace in melody and harmony, I felt something stir in me. A longing, a recognition, a whisper of possibility. "Will you play for me again?" Sebastian asked. "Not the heart song, not yet. Something else, something that tells me who you are, the way Isabel's music told me who she was." I looked at the silver flute still clutched in his hands, at the pianoforte against the wall, at the shelves of instruments waiting to be played. I thought of the years I had spent in silence, the doors I had closed, the parts of myself I had locked away, and I thought of this man who had married me without expecting love, who had opened his secrets to me without demanding mine in return, who was asking now for something I had not given anyone in longer than I could remember. I crossed to the shelf and selected a flute, not Isabel's silver one, but a simpler instrument of dark wood, worn smooth with use. I raised it to my lips, closed my eyes, and began to play. The melody that emerged was one I had composed years ago, in another life, when I was a different person with different dreams. It was a song about loss and longing, about doors that close and windows that open, about the courage it takes to speak when silence is safer. I had never played it for anyone. I had almost forgotten I had written it. But now, in this hidden room with Sebastian and Mrs. Holloway listening, I remembered. I remembered all of it. The girl I had been, the woman I had become, the path that had led me here, to this house, to this man, to this moment of unexpected revelation. When the last note faded into silence, I lowered the flute and opened my eyes. Sebastian was watching me with an expression I could not name, something between wonder and pain and tenderness. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my face in his hands, gently, reverently, as though I were something precious he was afraid to break. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I do not know what happened to you. I do not know why you chose silence or what pain drove you to it. But I want you to know that I see you, I hear you. And whatever you are able to give, whatever you are able to share, I will receive it with gratitude and guard it with my life." I looked into his eyes, those winter sea eyes that had seemed so cold when I first met him, and I saw warmth there now. Warmth and hope, and the beginning of something that might, with time and care, grow into love. I could not speak. I had not spoken in years, and the words were locked away in a place I could not yet reach. But I could do something else. I could offer him a gift that I had given no one else, a piece of myself that I had kept hidden and protected. I raised my hand and placed it over his heart, feeling the steady beat beneath my palm. And then I leaned forward and pressed my lips to his, a kiss that was soft and brief and full of promise. When I pulled back, Sebastian's eyes were bright with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the music, for the kiss, for being here, for being you." I smiled, the first real smile I had allowed myself since coming to Ravenshollow, and I saw his face transform with answering joy. We left the secret music room together, Mrs. Holloway following behind us with a quiet satisfaction that spoke of duties fulfilled and burdens lifted. The passages seemed less dark now, less foreboding, as though the secrets they had hidden had lost their power to frighten. We emerged into the West Wing corridor and stood for a moment in the light that streamed through the windows, blinking at the brightness of the ordinary day. The mystery was solved. Isabel's ghost was not a ghost at all, but a grieving servant playing a beloved melody in memory of a woman she had loved. The heart song had been for Sebastian all along, a confession and a gift that Isabel had never been able to deliver. And the truth, buried beneath years of guilt and silence, had finally been unearthed. But as I stood there in the corridor with Sebastian's hand warm in mine, I knew that this was not the end. It was a beginning. The beginning of healing for both of us. The beginning of a marriage that might become something real. The beginning of a love that neither of us had expected or sought, but that had found us anyway, in the strangest and most wonderful of ways. That evening, we dined together as we always had, but everything was different. Sebastian talked, really talked, telling me stories of his childhood, his brother, his parents, the house he had grown up in, and the man he had become. I listened, as I always listened, but now my listening felt like participation rather than observation. We were two people sharing a meal and a conversation, and if my half of that conversation was conducted in nods and smiles and the occasional written note, it did not seem to matter. After dinner, Sebastian led me to the music room, the main one, not Isabel's secret sanctuary. He sat down at the pianoforte and played something simple and beautiful, a melody I did not recognize, but that spoke of hope and renewal. And when he finished, he looked at me and asked if I would play too. I took up Isabel's silver flute, the one Mrs. Holloway had finally surrendered, and I played the heart song one more time. But this time, it did not sound sad. It sounded like a promise, like a blessing from a woman who had loved this house and this man, and who had, in her own way, given her permission for something new to grow in the space she had left behind. When the last note faded, Sebastian rose from the pianoforte and came to stand beside me. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply took my hand and raised it to his lips and kissed it, and in that gesture I felt everything he could not say and everything I could not answer. We stood there for a long time, in the music room filled with instruments and memories, while the candles burned low and the night deepened around us. And when we finally parted, each returning to our separate chambers, I carried with me a warmth that I had not felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new steps on the path we had only just begun to walk. But for tonight, it was enough to know that the haunting was over. The truth was known, and the silence between us had become a language of its own. A language of understanding, a language of hope, a language of love, still unspoken, but no longer impossible. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my lips and Isabel's melody playing softly in my dreams, and for the first time since coming to Ravenshollow, I did not listen for ghosts in the dark. There were no more ghosts, only the living, learning to live again. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most beautiful of my life. Ravenshollow, which had seemed so cold and forbidding when I first arrived, began to reveal itself as something else entirely. A home, a sanctuary, a place where the past could be honored without being imprisoned by it, where grief could soften into memory and memory could make room for hope. Sebastian and I fell into a rhythm that suited us both. We took breakfast together each morning, walked the gardens in the afternoons when the weather permitted, and spent our evenings in the music room, he at the pianoforte and I with one of the many flutes that now felt like old friends. We did not speak much, but our silence had transformed. It was no longer the silence of strangers maintaining careful distance. It was the silence of two people who had learned to communicate without words, who could read each other's thoughts in a glance, a gesture, a shift in posture. Mrs. Holloway, too, had changed. The stern facade she had maintained for so long had softened, and I caught her smiling sometimes when she thought no one was watching. She had been carrying her secret for 2 years, playing Isabel's music in the hidden passages, keeping alive the memory of a woman she had loved. Now that the secret was known, she seemed lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She treated me with a warmth that surprised me at first, but came to feel natural, as though I had earned her respect by helping to bring the truth to light. The household staff noticed the change in their master. I could tell. Sebastian laughed now, something he apparently had not done since Isabel's death. He spent less time locked in his study and more time in the common rooms, engaging with the business of the estate, visiting tenants, attending to the responsibilities he had neglected in his grief. The servants whispered about it, I knew, exchanged glances when they thought we were not looking. They were curious about the silent bride who had somehow thawed the frozen duke, but they were kind enough not to ask questions. It was on a morning in late November, nearly 2 months after my arrival at Ravenshollow, that Sebastian asked me to walk with him to the chapel. The chapel was a small stone building at the edge of the estate, half hidden by ancient yews and covered in climbing ivy that had long since lost its leaves. I had seen it from a distance but never approached it, sensing that it held significance I was not yet ready to understand. Sebastian had mentioned once that Isabel was buried there, in the Blackwood family crypt beneath the altar. I had not asked to see it. Some places require an invitation. Now, as we walked through the crisp autumn air with frost crunching beneath our boots, Sebastian explained why he wanted me to come. I have not visited her grave since the funeral, he said, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. I could not bear to. Every time I thought of going, I was overwhelmed by guilt, by the memory of that last night, by the belief that I had failed her in every way that mattered. He paused, looking out across the moor that stretched beyond the chapel, brown and gold and silver under the pale morning sun. But now I want to go. I want to tell her that I understand, that I know she loved me, that I have finally forgiven myself, as she would have wanted me to. He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw a vulnerability that made my heart ache. Will you come with me? I do not think I can do it alone. I took his hand in answer, and we continued toward the chapel together. The interior was small and simple, a single nave with wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers. Stained glass windows cast colored light across the stone floor, depicting scenes of saints and angels that seemed to watch us with benevolent eyes. At the front of the chapel was an altar draped in white cloth, and beside it, a door that led down to the crypt below. Sebastian paused at the door, his hand on the iron handle. He was trembling, I realized, not with cold, but with emotion. I squeezed his hand, offering what comfort I could, and after a moment he pushed the door open and began to descend the narrow stairs. The crypt was cool and quiet, lit by candles that flickered in sconces along the walls. Stone tombs lined the chamber, each bearing the name of a Blackwood ancestor, their dates and titles carved into the marble. At the far end, newer and simpler than the others, was Isabel's tomb. Sebastian stopped before it and stood in silence for a long moment. I remained beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched, watching as he gathered his thoughts. "Isabel," he said finally, and his voice echoed softly in the stone chamber. "I have come to say goodbye. Not forever, not in a way that erases you or forgets you, but in a way that lets us both rest." He paused, swallowing hard. "I read your diary. I found your letter. I know now what you wanted to tell me, what you would have said if you had lived. You chose me. You loved me. And I spent 2 years torturing myself with guilt when I should have been honoring your memory by living fully, loving again, becoming the man you believed I could be." He reached out and laid his hand on the cold marble of her tomb. "I am sorry I did not see you clearly when you were alive. I am sorry I was jealous of your music instead of grateful for your gift. I am sorry I confronted you in anger instead of listening with compassion. But I cannot change the past. I can only learn from it and try to do better and carry your love with me as I build a new life." He was weeping now, silent tears that tracked down his cheeks and fell onto the stone floor. I moved closer and put my arm around him, offering the comfort of my presence, the warmth of my body against his in the cold of the crypt. "There is someone I want you to meet," Sebastian continued, his voice rough but steady. "Her name is Eleanor, and she is my wife now. She came to me without expectations, without demands, asking nothing but a place to belong. And she has given me something I did not know I needed. She has given me hope." He looked at me, his eyes bright with tears and something else, something that made my breath catch. "I think you would have liked her, Isabel. I think you would have been friends. She understands music the way you did. She speaks in silence the way you spoke in song. And she has helped me find my way back to the light." I felt tears prick my own eyes as I listened to him. No one had ever spoken of me that way, with such tenderness, such admiration, such love. Because that was what it was, I realized. Love. Not the grand, passionate, consuming love of novels and operas, but something quieter and more sustaining. The love of two broken people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. Sebastian turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "Eleanor," he said, and my name in his mouth was a prayer. "I know I said I would not ask more of you than you were willing to give. I know I promised not to expect love. But I find I cannot keep that promise. Not because I want to break my word, but because my heart has already made its choice. I love you. I love your silence and your music and your courage. I love the way you listen and the way you watch and the way you understand things without being told. And if you cannot return my feelings, I will accept that. But I needed you to know. I needed you to hear it, at least once, spoken aloud." I looked at him, this man who had married me out of convenience and found in me something he had not expected. This man who had opened his secrets to me, who had wept in my arms, who had asked for my help when he could not face his ghosts alone. This man who was offering me his heart without demanding mine in return. And I realized, standing in that cold crypt with the ghost of his first wife watching over us, that I loved him too. I had not planned to love him. I had not thought myself capable of such feelings. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the years of silence and solitude and careful self-protection. But love had found me anyway, creeping in through the cracks in my armor, growing in the spaces between us until it filled my chest with a warmth I could no longer ignore. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to open my mouth and speak the words that had been locked away for so long. To give him the gift of my voice as he had given me the gift of his heart. But my voice was buried deep, trapped behind walls I had built years ago, and I did not know if I could tear them down. I closed my eyes and thought of the girl I had been before the silence, the girl who had laughed and sung and played the flute with abandon, who had believed the world was full of beauty and possibility. That girl had been hurt, badly hurt, by someone who should have protected her. She had retreated into silence as a defense, a way of making herself small and invisible, a way of ensuring that no one could ever use her words against her again. But Sebastian was not the person who had hurt me. Sebastian was kind and gentle and patient. Sebastian had never demanded my voice, had accepted my silence without question, had loved me not despite my quiet, but because of it. If there was anyone I could trust with my words, it was him. I took a deep breath. I opened my eyes, and I opened my mouth. Sebastian. The word came out rough and broken, barely more than a whisper, rusty from years of disuse. But it was there. It was real. It was the first word I had spoken in nearly a decade, and it was his name. Sebastian's eyes went wide with shock. He stared at me as though I had performed a miracle, as though I had risen from the dead, as though the world had suddenly become a different place than it had been a moment before. "Eleanor," he breathed. "You spoke. You said my name." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, my throat tight with the effort of producing sound. And then, because I had already crossed the threshold, because the walls were crumbling and there was no point in trying to rebuild them, I spoke again. "I love you." The words were stronger this time, clearer, though my voice still trembled with emotion. Sebastian let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and then he was pulling me into his arms, holding me so tightly that I could barely breathe, and I did not care because I was holding him just as tightly, and we were both weeping, and the world had become a place of impossible wonder. "Say it again," he murmured against my hair. "Please, I want to hear it again. I love you, Sebastian. I love you." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his face transformed with joy. "All this time," he said, "all these weeks, I thought your silence was permanent. I thought you could not speak or would not, and I accepted it because I loved you regardless. But you can speak. You chose to speak. For me. For us," I corrected him, and my voice was growing stronger now, more confident, as though it remembered what it had once been capable of. "For the life we are building. For the love we have found." Sebastian kissed me then, deeply and thoroughly, and I kissed him back with all the passion I had kept locked away for so long. When we finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, I looked at Isabel's tomb and felt a strange sense of gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly, addressing the woman I had never met but had come to know through her music and her words. "Thank you for loving him. Thank you for leading me to him. I will take care of him now." Sebastian followed my gaze, and something passed across his face, a mixture of grief and acceptance and peace. "She would have wanted this," he said quietly. "She would have wanted me to be happy." "I believe she did," I agreed. "I believe that is why the music led us here." We left the crypt together, climbing the narrow stairs back into the chapel above. The stained glass windows glowed with colored light, reds and blues and golds that painted our skin with warmth, and outside I could hear the songs of birds welcoming the day. We walked out of the chapel and stood for a moment in the crisp morning air, looking back at the small stone building that had witnessed so much grief and had now witnessed something else entirely. "What will you do now?" Sebastian asked, turning to me with a smile that transformed his face. "Now that you have found your voice again?" I considered the question. There were so many possibilities, so many doors that had been closed for so long and were now open again. I could speak to the servants, to Mrs. Holloway, to the neighbors who would soon learn that the silent Duchess was silent no longer. I could read aloud from books in the library, sing songs in the music room, have conversations over breakfast and dinner and tea. "But first," I said slowly, "I think I would like to play the heart song one more time, not as a haunting, not as a memory, but as a celebration of Isabel, and of us, and of everything that is yet to come." Sebastian took my hand and raised it to his lips. "Then, let us go," he said. "Let us fill this house with music and laughter and love. Let us honor the past while building the future. Let us live, Eleanor, truly live, as we both deserve." We walked back to Ravenshollow hand in hand, the great house rising before us in the morning light. It looked different now, I thought. Warmer, more welcoming. The home it had always meant to be before grief and guilt had cast their shadows across it. In the music room, I took up Isabel's silver flute for the last time. Sebastian sat at the pianoforte, ready to accompany me, and Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I raised the flute to my lips and began to play. The heart song filled the room, filled the house, filled the spaces that had been empty for so long. But it did not sound sad anymore. It sounded triumphant. It sounded like love and loss and redemption, like the end of one story and the beginning of another. It sounded like everything Isabel had wanted to say and everything I had learned in the weeks since my arrival. When the last note faded, I lowered the flute and looked at the two people who had become my family. Sebastian was smiling, his eyes full of love. Mrs. Holloway was weeping, but her tears were tears of joy. And I, for the first time in longer than I could remember, felt whole. I had come to Ravenshollow expecting nothing. I had married a stranger, entered a house full of secrets, and found myself caught up in a mystery I had not anticipated. But in solving that mystery, in uncovering the truth about Isabel and her heart song, I had found something far more valuable than answers. I had found my voice again. I had found love. I had found a home. And as I stood in the music room with my husband beside me, and the future stretching out before us like an unwritten song, I knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. There would be days of doubt and moments of fear. But there would also be music and laughter, and the quiet comfort of a love that had grown from silence into something stronger than words. Isabel's heart song had been her farewell, her gift, her blessing. And now it was my inheritance, a melody I would carry with me always, a reminder that even the deepest grief can give way to joy, that even the longest silence can end in song. I set down the silver flute and took Sebastian's hand. "Come," I said, and the word felt like a miracle on my lips. "Let us begin." And together, hand in hand, we walked out of the music room and into the rest of our lives. The house was quiet that night, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. Not the silence of secrets and sorrow, but the peace of a place that had finally found its rest. Ravenshollow had been haunted, not by ghosts, but by grief. And now that grief had been acknowledged and released, the house itself seemed to breathe more easily. I lay in my bed, Sebastian beside me for the first time, and listened to the sounds of the night. The creak of old wood settling, the whisper of wind against the windows, the distant hoot of an owl hunting on the moors, and beneath it all, like a heartbeat, the rhythm of Sebastian's breathing, steady and slow and peaceful. I had not expected this, any of this. I had come to Ravenshollow prepared to spend my life in quiet solitude, a wife in name only, a woman who had given up on love and happiness and the possibility of being truly known. But life, I was learning, had a way of surprising us, of offering gifts we had not asked for, of opening doors we had thought were locked forever. I thought of my mother, dead these many years, who had taught me to play the flute when I was a girl. I thought of my father, desperate and broken, who had sold me to save himself. I thought of the man who had hurt me, whose name I would never speak again, who had stolen my voice and my trust and my faith in the goodness of others. And I thought of Sebastian, who had given all of those things back to me, not by demanding them, but by creating a space where they could grow again on their own. I turned my head on the pillow and looked at him sleeping beside me, his face peaceful in the faint light from the window. He was not perfect. He had made mistakes, had loved his first wife imperfectly, had let his grief and guilt consume him for years. But he was good, he was kind, he was mine, and I was his. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me, and my dreams were full of music, sweet and bright and endless, carrying me forward into a future I had never dared to imagine, but that was now, impossibly, beautifully, mine. The silent woman had found her voice. The grieving duke had found his peace, and Ravenshollow, the great house on the moors, had found its heart again. This is how our story ends, and how it begins. With music, with love, with the courage to speak after years of silence and the grace to listen after years of deafness. With the heart song that brought us together, and the life we will build in its wake, forever.